guidance presentations. So this one is coming back home to me for me, but it's a um, completely different angle. So the messy gardening angle, I think, um, when I was first asked to do it with the messy garden angle, is like, oh, I don't know, because that's really wildscapey. But it really does emphasize the aspects of habitat that are really important, that frequently get overlooked in the wintertime. So let's just dive right in. If you're in this program, I think that you probably have a concept of what habitat is, but let's just kind of touch on it real quick. Of course, habitat is just that area that wildlife can survive and reproduce. It has the elements of food, water, and shelter. Shelter for adults and for young, from weather and from predators. And that kind of habitat can be found anywhere. But a lot of times when we're thinking about wildlife habitat, we think about places that are way out in the middle of nature, right? You have natural habitat. And it's way off and in large amounts. So is this habitat? And in the chat, I encourage you to go ahead and get started talking about, is this habitat? This is Los Naples State Natural Area. It's in Central Texas. Yeah, I think it's beautiful habitat. It's got water, certainly. That's usually the most difficult element to provide. It's got a variety of different native species of trees. It's managed for native species. So you don't have a whole lot of non-native, aggressive, exotic species in there. And that's important because most of our species are, the base of our food web are invertebrates and insects. Insects and other invertebrates. And those species, 90% of those species are specialists to native plants. Not all of them, some of them are generalists, but most of those are specialists to our native plants. So if you, and it turns out that in many of our natural areas, not this one, but many other areas, 30, 50, sometimes even 80% of that plant matter is actually non-native. So even though you've got a great big open space, you don't have the native plants that are required for good, diverse wildlife habitat, even out in even out in rural habitat areas. Okay, so soapbox, sorry, let's get back on track. But because what is this? Okay, so this is not natural. This is in the middle of the city, but you can definitely find grackle nests in this area. The grackles are finding food. They're apparently finding shelter. This is habitat. It's habitat for a very restricted group of species, the species that are generalist species. They do pretty well just about anywhere. So you're not going to find chickadees or Carolina wrens or anything like that. You're going to find grackles and maybe some house sparrows, maybe a pigeon or two. They're going to find a lot of food here, a lot of calories here, and then they can nest and roost just about anywhere. So that's why they find these areas for valuable habitat. So now that we know that habitat can look like just about anything, we know now it's a matter of degrees, right? We're going to try to define what kind of habitat we want. Do we want something that's like all one species, kind of like this McDonald's parking lot or HEB parking lot? Or are we going to have something that's more balanced, that has a variety of wildlife species in it? Entire food webs that are represented, food chains that are represented within it, so that you see a functioning ecosystem providing all the services that a healthy ecosystem could do. So I have found that just about the biggest impact any of us can have is by managing, conserving, preserving, and managing the area of land that they have direct access to, that they can monitor, that they can manipulate, that they can change. And so let's take a little look at the spaces that we all have, that many of us are lucky enough to have and manage. Average lawn size, average yard size, or property size in the United States is about a little less than a quarter acre, or about a fifth of an acre. And about 50 million acres nationwide are dedicated to lawn space. That is including gardens, turf grass, ornamental areas, everything, all of that put together is about 50 million acres. And there's a study that's cited down there at the bottom. 82% of that is dedicated to a non-native alien species. That is whatever variety of turf grass you have, it's frequently not going to be native. So we do have some buffalo grass lawns. Those are not considered in this total, but we have mostly zoysia, centipede grass, St. Augustine grass, Bermuda grass, those top turf grasses. Are they terrible? No, they are sequestering carbon. They are slowing water down, but are they doing it in a way that could be considered ecologically functional? Well, I'm not really sure. But if we, okay, so that's 50 million acres in the United States dedicated to lawns. Imagine all the water that goes into that, for example. But a lot of times people say, well, yeah, okay, but that's kind of offset by all of our national parks. So we all know and love our national open spaces, but as vast as they are, they comprise only 2% of the total land area of the United States. Okay, so what does that mean? If half, so we're not going to convert all of our lawns to native spaces, right? That's crazy. Do you have to have 100% native lawn? No. But if you were to convert half of your garden, half of your land area to native plants and then managed for ecological health, we could create a national park, a nationwide national park of 20 million acres. That's roughly 10 times the size of Yellowstone. We could do that if we all took a little bit of personal responsibility and managed for ecological health. Okay, so now let's take a look and see what we can do to go from a lawn that's more traditional, like this one that has maybe 5 or 6 different species of it, and most of those are from areas across the globe, certainly not native species, certainly not things that support native caterpillars, arthropods, and other wildlife species that are the base of the food web that generate a whole diversity of species. How can we go from that to something that looks a little bit more like the area below, that has the food, water, shelter, and space that's required for native species, species that are native to this area? So, okay, in this part of the talk, not this part of the talk, in this part of my wildscape talk, I usually start talking now about how to incorporate native plants into a landscape and to make it more ecologically friendly. But today, we're going to look a little deeper. So you've got the first step, right? You want ecological health. And the second step is, you know, that really means planting or creating habitat that has, or creating landscapes that have species that are more native to an area. What's the next step? The next step is recognizing that native landscapes, or ecological landscapes in general, are not static. They're always moving, they're always changing. And one of the cycles that we observe in ecological systems are seasonal cycles. So let's look. The needs of wildlife change depending on the time of year. The springtime is the easiest time, right? We know that things are nesting. We know that birds are making, that they're building nests, they're depositing eggs in nests, they're caring for those eggs. Things are starting to hatch. It could be caterpillars, it could be butterflies, it could be birds, it could be those native bees. And things are beginning to start to emerge from their rejuvenation time. So things like native bees or other species that might have gone into a diapause, that is a slumber during the wintertime, or maybe they're hatching their young and they're emerging from the different substrates that they nested in. So spring is a time of renewal, nesting, hatching, emerging. You need a lot of invertebrate species to fuel that kind of growth. And so you're going to see a lot of birds in particular eating insects and other invertebrates, frogs also doing the same thing. Anything that needs to reproduce is generally going to look to a more meat-centered diet, insect-centered diet, because that provides the carotenoids, the calcium, the minerals, the proteins, the fats that are all necessary for that really energy-intensive time of producing young. In the summertime, we see a lot of feeding, a lot of caring. So you're seeing chickadees, for example, going back and forth to the nest with caterpillars, 1, 2, 3 at a time. Maybe grasshoppers, other arthropods, spiders actually are this. So the most important component of a chickadee's diet is caterpillars of various species. The second most important are spiders. It's very interesting. So carrying and feeding. We think of hummingbirds during the summertime. They're doing a lot of feeding from the sugar water feeders that we put out and also native plants, the nectar, but they're also actually more interested in those tiny mites and spiders that are found down in the nectar tube of flowers. And so they're eating those fats, again, those proteins that are necessary for nesting and growing. And and I've got growing as well. So things like frogs that have laid their eggs, they have hatched, and now they're growing, metamorphosizing into froglets from their tadpole stage. So things are really, it's very energy intense. We've got a lot of energy being produced, and the foundation of that are generally insects or plants. So plants is actually the foundational foundation. Well, actually, if you go a little down deeper, it's the flora within the fungi and flora and bacteria in the soil that's actually the base space. But anyway, you understand what I'm saying. The plants generate energy from the sun, and they're going to be giving some of their energy to the next leg on the rung, and that's going to be arthropods, insects, and other invertebrates, and then it goes on up from there. The fall is an interesting time. It's a time when the feeding habits tend to start to change. So instead of focusing entirely on caterpillars, arthropods, and spiders, a lot of wildlife species are moving over to plant matter, fruits, seeds, nuts, things like that in order to feed. So the diet of one animal can change, or usually does change, over time, which is weird for humans to think about. You know, we think about, well, we can eat just about anything, just about any time, right? We've got apples in the summertime, and we've got grapes in the wintertime, you know, or tomatoes in the wintertime. We can eat just about anything, anytime. But for wildlife species, many species actually physiologically change so that they can't eat the same stuff that they were eating just a few months prior. The easiest example is white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer, we tend to put out corn for them to eat, or other protein sources for them to eat. They can eat that plant matter in the wintertime, hush, in the springtime. Sorry, not in the wintertime. Sorry, my dogs are getting upset, so I got a little distracted. But we tend to put that corn in there, but it turns out corn is actually terrible for white-tailed deer in the wintertime. They can't digest it very well. And so you'll actually see in the farther northern states, you'll see white-tailed deer actually starve to death with their bellies full of corn, which is a disheartening thing. So understand that different wildlife species have different needs at different times of the year. There's a time of preparation, a time of larding, a hoarding time. So like that little squirrel there has got his little piece of fruit there, I think, but of course they're putting away seeds and nuts for the winter time. And it's a time to migrate. So monarch butterflies will begin their migration along with many other birds in the fall. So it's a time of high energy use again, but a different type of energy that they're tending to use. In the wintertime, you might wonder, what is it that happens to wildlife in the wintertime? Their experience, so the wintertime is a time, it's a difficult and fragile time, not just for birds and deer that we tend to see and think about, but also for the small spiders, caterpillars, arthropods, worms, salamanders, lizards, dragonflies, lots of species that we just don't think about. So a lot of times we think about feeding the birds and the deer sometimes, but we don't think about all those other species that are out there that are experiencing this fragile time as well. So this is the time when what we're talking about, messy gardening, comes into play. Because messy gardening, it's not really about letting things go, because I advocate that if you're making any decision, whether it's a decision to mow or not mow or whatever it is that you're going to do, you're making a decision that affects wildlife species. So making a decision to do nothing is a decision in itself. And so, sorry, I'm getting a whole bunch of notifications for some reason on my phone. So in this presentation, we're going to take it as a given that you know that all wildlife are valuable on their own, as well as for the role that they have in the ecosystem. So let's go over a few species in particular and find out what they do during the wintertime and how we can help them survive this difficult and fragile time. By the way, I just want to explain what those pictures are. So stasis, that is some species, the adults will mate and lay eggs in the fall, and those eggs will overwinter in stasis until the springtime when they will begin to develop and hatch and of course produce young. So that's one way to overwinter. Another way to spend the winter, or at least survive some cold days, is to go into what's called torpor. Torpor is hummingbirds famously go into a torpor state, where it's kind of like hibernating, but it's shortened. So it only happens, through the cold little snap that they experience. Of course, that's really just the ends of within the migration time, if they're on the end of the spring or the beginning of fall, or end of fall, beginning of spring, you know what I mean? And so they go into a deep sleep where they reduce their body temperature, they reduce their metabolism to almost nothing. In fact, they can't wake up. If you pick them up, they won't be able to revive themselves until they get warmer and their metabolism and their body temperature goes up. Another way to spend the winter is in what's called diapause. Diapause is very similar to hibernation also, but it's found in invertebrates. And it is also a time of reduced metabolism, reduced body temperature. Of course, these are for ectotherms. Those are things that get their energy from outside the body. And so one way to do that is to go into kind of a sleep. And one way they do that is to wrap themselves up in leaves, wrap themselves up in other material, spin a little bit of silk in it, and spend the winter that way. Okay, so what are some different species that we can look at, how we might be able to provide for them? One of them is just the jewel of any garden. It's frequently photographed, frequently painted, is the tiger swallowtail. We have a number of different swallowtail species in central Texas. Tiger swallowtail is one that you are able to find. We also have Palomedes swallowtail, spicebush swallowtail, and black swallowtail. And they all have a kind of a similar set of behaviors that get them through the winter. First of all, there's 2 generations per year. The first generation happens in the spring. It starts as an egg, of course, and laid on the leaf of a host plant. That egg eventually matures, hatches into a caterpillar. That's a great big one. And they go and eat a lot of plant matter. That's on a non-native buddleia, by the way, but it was such a good picture of the caterpillar. I wanted to use it and his little eye spots there. And so the caterpillar eats the green material or the leafy material and matures, and then finally finds a place about 3 meters or less off the ground, sometimes more, but usually it's close to the ground. And the mature caterpillar or the last instar of the caterpillar will find a fence post maybe, or a piece of bark, or a rock, or I found them just about anywhere that doesn't move for like a day or two. If it doesn't move in the garden, it's going to have a chrysalis on it at some point, hopefully, fingers crossed. So the last stage instar caterpillar goes to that place. It spins a little attachment silk, kind of like a little hammock. It kind of goes around it and suspends it in that way. It's actually quite strong. And as you can imagine, it's kind of cryptic looking. It just looks like another piece of bark or something in the area where it is. And so the first generation spins that, metamorphosizes in that cocoon, and then emerges as the butterfly. That butterfly in the summertime goes around, gets a lot of energy, finds a mate, lays eggs. They do the whole dance again. But that next cocoon, or that next chrysalis, not cocoon, it's a butterfly, doesn't hatch or doesn't metamorphose immediately. It hangs on for a while, and it hangs on through the winter time. So what happens if you're something that's like, a meter or 2 off the ground, and you're up against a tree, or you're in some dead shrubbery, or not dead, but dormant shrubbery or dormant perennials or dormant or dying annuals. So in a yard, out of nature, it's no big deal. Those things disintegrate eventually, but they don't disintegrate very fast, right? So they're going to be up there for at least the wintertime season. And then they usually come down very quickly with the spring rains. But in a garden, a lot of times those things are cleaned out. Well, when you clean out all those stems, you're going to be cleaning out all the chrysalises that are in there as well. So these tiger swallowtail butterflies, black swallowtail, palamedes, etc., those, they don't hang out as adults or eggs. So if we wipe out all the chrysalises, we wipe out all the swallowtail butterflies.
That's a good point.
We also have a ton of native bees. So we have over 190 species of native bee, or bees that are native to Texas. And these bees are extremely beneficial. Many of them are specialists to different flower types. So when we think of the Save the Bees movement, we typically think about the European honeybee, right? The bee that we see everywhere, the yellow and black bee that has a communal hive and a queen and produces honey that we then harvest. That's actually a non-native bee. It's really no more native than like a horse or a cow or a pig, right? There are things that have escaped into nature, but they're actually a domesticated animal. We've been cohabitating with them for a very long time, but nevertheless, they're not native species. We do have native species of bee here. None of them create the large communal nest that the European honeybee does, or now we call them the Western honeybee. None of them create that big, large communal nest. We have some that nest in the ground, some that nest in logs, some that nest in branches, some that nest in the hollow stems of perennials or annuals. And that's what this little bee is doing. And I apologize, I have forgotten his little name. But the thing that he does that is really, or she does that is very cool, is once they have mated, and there is one female and one male, and they mate, very different from the communal style with a queen. So every female is a queen. I kind of like that system myself. Every female is a queen. But what they do is they lay their eggs, their fertilized eggs, down in the stem of a perennial or an annual that's gone dormant. So these thin stems that are easy to chew out of, but provide some protection in the wintertime. So they lay their eggs within these stems, and then as the eggs hatch and begin to grow into larvae, you can see the different stages of larvae down here at the bottom, on the bottom picture, the 3 little bees in different stages of development. So they lay them sequentially so that the last one in the series is actually the oldest one. So they lay toward the top first, and then they move down toward the center, because what's going to happen is the top one is going to come out first, right? It's going to emerge first when it matures. So they spend the wintertime in the stem, and then in the springtime, when temperatures are above about 50 degrees pretty consistently, the maturation process is complete, and they start emerging out of these tubes, out of these stems. What's another one? Tawny emperor. So tawny emperor is cool. They spend most of their life in hackberry trees, right? They are a specialist to hackberry species, netleaf hackberry, sugarleaf hackberry, and they're what's called a rolling insect, I guess, and butterfly. So what they do is you'll find these leaves that are all rolled up real tight. What happens is they lay their eggs in an area, and they kind of attach silk in it, so that as the leaf dries, it begins to curl inward, and it does that because of the way that the silk has been attached. So it's a very cool system. And once they hatch and they spend the winter in this area, they hatch, and as caterpillars they emerge and they start eating the hackberry tree imperceptibly. It's amazing to me how many butterflies can come out of one hackberry tree. But a lot of times you'll find these rolled up cocoon-like structures, and that's what's going on. We also can't forget the decomposers. Decomposers are within our soil, the funguses. Now, of course, these are mushrooms that you can easily see, but there's a whole host of other funguses that grow underneath the leaf litter that are very, very important at taking that dead leaf material, those leaves and stems and branches and things that have fallen to the ground and other animals that have fallen to the ground, and decompose them and return those nutrients to the soil. They play a really important part in the ecosystem, whether it's earthworms or fungi or fungi like mushrooms or other bacteria. These things are really important and must be present for you to have healthy soil. Okay, so let's look at a little story real quick. I like this story a lot. This is a goldenrod. Goldenrod, they're pretty much done blooming right about now. But goldenrod, it puts out this beautiful pyramid of golden colored flowers, right? They're frequently confused with what, ragweed, because ragweed blooms at the same time that goldenrod does, and ragweed causes a lot of allergies. And so people who are having allergy problems, they look to the things that are blooming and they see the goldenrod, so they falsely think that the goldenrod is the thing causing their allergies, when in fact, it's the ragweed. That's not so much of a problem here in Austin. Most people understand the difference between the two of them because they're really more focused on the cedar fever that we get. But in Houston, where I grew up, this was always blamed for allergies when it's not at all. But anyway, it supports, just like I mentioned earlier in the program, that a number of different species, 90% of our invertebrate species, including insects and arthropods, are dependent on native species of plant in order to survive one way or another. And one of those is the goldenrod parasitoid or gall wasp, G-A-L-L, goldenrod gall, G-A-L-L wasp. Or maybe it's a fly. Anyway, it's a gall, it's a, it looks like a fly, doesn't it? But I think it's a wasp. Anyway, I think it's a parasitoid wasp. Anyway, the deal with this is it is only able to reproduce with the assistance or the cooperation of goldenrod. So what it does is it lays its egg into the tissue of the stem of the goldenrod. The egg then has chemicals within it that changes the DNA of the goldenrod and actually induces it to produce a different structure than it normally would. So it produces what's called a gall. This gall is a round ball looking thing. You can find them in any gall. You look in any goldenrod patch, you will find these little galls. And inside that, if you were to break one open, and you can, you'd find that most of the hard matter on the outside that forms the ball is plant matter. You can see the cells of plant matter, but it's unorganized. So it's just all balled up together in plant matter. But in the very center of it is a little chamber. And within that chamber is going to be either the egg or the larva. And so if the egg is hatched out, of course, it'll be the larva. And that larva, what it does is it starts to eat its way out of that gall in order to emerge in the spring. So that's cool, right? It's got its own little breakfast, lunch, and dinner right there. It's got its own little, like a chicken egg has the nutritional elements outside the where the embryo is. Anyway, so it's eating its way out, and then it'll emerge as an adult parasitizing wasp itself. Okay, so that's interesting in and of itself, I think. But what's even cooler to me is that there are actually a couple of species of birds that have figured out that this gall may be difficult to get into. But once you get into it, it has got a delicious little caterpillar inside that is completely defenseless. So you'll see chickadees, Carolina chickadees, and also downy woodpeckers have figured out how to exploit these little galls. Now, they're hard to get into. Of course, with the woodpecker, it's a lot easier to get into. They're hard to get into, but they're real easy to find. So it's a guaranteed food source if nothing else has gotten into them. So, but what happens then if we were to cut out all of our goldenrods once they lose their autumn beauty? And in the wintertime, if we were to cut down these galls, well, the galls would disappear, obviously, and so would the next generation of gall wasps. But then what would happen to the species that then depend on them in order to survive? So we see that this whole network of species works together to create a functioning ecosystem. So I've gone over some of the species and some of the things that they do. I kind of wanted to show a representation of different groups of species and how they handle the wintertime. So what are some actions that you can take in the wintertime? When we say messy gardening, we're not exactly saying no gardening, because you might want to be able to do some things, but those decisions that you make will affect what species are able to survive. So let's think about the bees. Again, at the end of the summer, of course, bumblebee queens burrow just below the soil to wait out the winter, give them extra protection they need, leave the leaves. So these are a bunch of little graphics that you're welcome to share. They're from xerces.org. You can find them on the interwebs. You can put them on social media. They're a lot of fun to use. So I just used a bunch of them because they've got pretty pictures and good messages on them. But things that you can do are to remember that some bare soil is okay. For bumblebees, they require bare soil in order to burrow into so that the female can go into it, deposit her eggs, and leave. So that's really important. And so then in the springtime, the baby bees will emerge from that little hole in the ground. These are not the aggressive bees. They can sting. They are bees. They can sting, but they don't. You really have to bother a bumblebee to get it to sting. And any of our native bees are the same way. They can sting, but unless you're digging out a nest, it's not going to. So what are some other habitat items that are required for bees, our native bees, in order to survive the winter? Remember we mentioned the stems that the bees will build or will deposit their eggs inside that host those eggs and larvae until they mature and can emerge. Soil, the same way. Branches, some will excavate holes into those branches. Also, fallen logs, they will excavate holes down into logs in order to deposit eggs. We have a log pile that we use to store our firewood, a firewood pile that we use to store firewood. There's one piece of firewood that always stays unburned because there are carpenter bees that enjoy. They are able to go inside. They've burrowed out a whole lot of holes, and I love watching them go in. They deposit their eggs and then they leave. And there's a whole little whole bunch of activities that go on around that egg laying activity, from nest defense, which is they never sting. They don't do anything like that. But they do make a big show about being real active around the nest. So it's pretty cool. How about creating no-mow zones? So a lot of times we have trees, but in urban areas, we have these mature trees and we put grass all the way up against the trunk that we then mow that grass, right? Well, it turns out that native caterpillars tend to drop from the tree's canopy to the ground to complete their life cycle. So they're up in the canopy, and then when they mature to that last instar, that is that last development stage, they drop from the tree to the ground in order to find a place that they can create a chrysalis or a cocoon in order to change into a butterfly or to a moth. And so what happens is when they drop into a grassy area, well, unfortunately, the area is oftentimes mowed, especially in the fall when things are growing very quickly. And they sometimes don't make it because they're mowed or they are unable to find some sort of structure on which to build their chrysalis. So consider putting a large ring of mulch, or even better would be a native ground cover like Virginia creeper, not English ivy, of course, something native that wildlife can use. Putting a ground cover that acts as protection and winter cover until they're able to get to an area that they can build their chrysalis, or they may even build their chrysalis right there in the Virginia creeper, which would be really cool. So birds will benefit from this as well as moths and the butterflies. Okay, what else can you do? Keep leaves on your property. You'll be happy to know that especially in the fall and in the wintertime, it's extremely important to not rake your lawn. By leaving leaves on your property, certainly don't rake them and take them off and put them in the dump. If you put them in the dump, they're going to go into a landfill. When they go into a landfill, they'll start to break down in the absence of oxygen. And what that does is create more methane. And that methane eventually does seep out of the landfill and contribute to greenhouse gases. So you don't want to do that. Of course, that doesn't even take into consideration any of the invertebrates that are trying to use that leaf litter in order to feed or to reproduce or to wait out the wintertime. So what are things that you can do? So of course, we don't want to have a real deep layer of leaves on our grass, but actually lawn scientists, turf scientists over at A&M have determined that actually a thin layer of leaves on top of your grass in the wintertime actually helps that grass survive. It reduces the fluctuations of temperature in the wintertime, so it creates a more favorable environment. You do want to rake them off the grass later in the year, in the spring, and of course in the fall, because you don't want to you want to manage what kind of funguses grow in your yard, in your turf grass. But then what you're going to do is you're just going to rake them off into your lawn, into your gardens, into the garden areas where you have native plants, because in this way you get free mulch. We know that we need free mulch. We know that we need mulch in the garden, and it's going to kind of pack down and weigh down and degrade and deteriorate at a very slow rate in a way that you can and return those nutrients back to the soil. What if you got too many leaves even for that? What you can do is rake them up in a pile in an area of your property that it's okay for them to decompose on their own. The last thing that you want to do is shred them, or the second to last thing. The last thing you want to do is ship them off to be put in the landfill. But the next to last thing to do is shred them, because of course there are all kinds of invertebrates, spiders, beetles, and eggs and chrysalises and cocoons that are going to be in there and get shredded also. We don't want to contribute to that. So if we want to pile it up for a natural compost that degrades naturally and slowly, that would be an acceptable thing to do as well. Okay, leave the leaves. So many butterflies and moths overwinter as chrysalises or cocoons disguised as dry leaves. Don't blow away their cover. Okay, so what can you do? The wintertime garden is a time of rest. It's a time of planning. It's a time of deciding what you're going to do in the springtime. It is really not the best time to do a whole lot of disturbing of the soil, disturbing of the leaves, disturbing of the stems and everything. If you can leave those things in place for the worst part of the wintertime, at least through February, you will really benefit. Your ecosystem will really benefit. Be sure to look for those chrysalises. You'll absolutely find them. Leave some of those leaves in the garden and let that garden rest. So but of course, we're not talking about absentee gardening, right? We really do want to provide habitat, but we also want to have a nice looking yard as well, right? So what's one way to do that? That springtime cleanup is important. It's a good way to get things rejuvenated, get those seedlings established, get things moving in the garden. But if you can delay that until temperatures are reliably above 50 degrees, most of those eggs and chrysalises will have matured and hatched out and emerged at that point. So it'd be a good time to do that springtime cleanup where you're taking up the extra leaves, taking up the extra vegetation, doing the composting. That can be done. And I usually think about February 14th, Valentine's Day, is a good day to start thinking about cutting back those perennials, gathering up the sticks and leaves, and cleaning up the garden. If you can leave seed heads, especially in stems, as long as you possibly can, those seed heads have tons of good, valuable energy stored within them that mostly birds will partake of, but other species will as well. And then, of course, once they're spent, leaving the stems there would be great for those bees and other insects that use those stems in order to lay their eggs and hatch their young. Bunch grasses are incredibly important. They're an important part of our ecosystem. You can classify grasses as either turf grasses or bunch grasses. Turf grasses are things that spread out along the top of the soil. They're things like buffalo grass and centipede grass and zoysia grass, and most of those Bermuda grass. Most of those species that we call a turf or we use for our lawns, those are considered turf grasses. But bunch grasses we have in this area, and our native habitat was comprised mostly of bunch grasses. So things like little blue stem, big muley, side oats grama, that's our state grass of Texas, inland sea oats. What are some other really good ones? Oh, silver blue stem is a good one too, big blue stem, bushy blue stem, all the blue stems, right? Um, these grasses are extraordinarily valuable in holding down the soil. So they put deep fibrous roots that are 3 times the depth as the height of their leaves. So if you have a bunch grass that's 2 feet tall, you're going to have roots in the soil that are 6 feet deep. It's really important because it's pulling water down into the soil, pulling nutrients up out of the base of the moving nutrients back and forth, and it's creating spaces in the soil to keep it friable and productive. But the biggest thing about grasses is that they hold the soil down and keep it from rotting away. Okay, I said all that to say this. Bunch grasses are also extraordinarily beneficial as hiding places for wildlife in the wintertime. So one of the management techniques we talk about is to mow bunch grasses in the late spring. Be sure to delay that mowing until, again, those temperatures rise up to reliably above 50 degrees, sometime in February, maybe early March. And that way you can retain that useful insulative cover for a variety of grassland nesting birds, roosting birds that roost on the ground, and other species that really benefit from having that resource. If you're a little worried about insect damage in your yard, because we know that plants are the foundation and insects are the first thing that are using that food resource. Take a tip from my friend Dr. Doug Talamay, and adopt the 10-step rule of pest management. And that is, you get up next to your plant, you take 10 steps back. If you still notice the plant damage from insect pests, then there's consideration for doing something about it. But if you can't see it 10 steps back, then that's just normal ecological services being done, and we just let it go. And make sure to retain the value of logs and snags. Snags are what biologists call the standing dead trees. They are valuable for a variety of species of wildlife like chickadees and titmice and owls and kestrels and woodpeckers and anything that nests in a cavity. So purple martins nest in cavities. So all these things like to nest in the cavities. Also, they're a great substrate for, that is a thing that things occur on, for beetles and borers and all kinds of different insects and salamanders and toads and frogs and things like that. So they're a fantastic resource in the garden. We sometimes say that snags are more valuable than live trees for wildlife species, and that's because of all the benefits of not just the food on the outside, but the shelter on the inside. So those things are not always appropriate to have. So if it's right next to your house, obviously you don't want that falling on your house. But if it is like 40 feet away from your house and away from your buildings, consider that that's a really valuable wildlife resource, and maybe it should be left. Logs as well. So I really, I kind of pushed back when I was first asked to do a program on messy gardening. In my heart, I don't think I argued too much, but I did kind of push back because I think that ecologically friendly gardening and landscaping suffers from a marketing problem. A lot of times when people hear things about native landscaping, they think about, messy, unkempt, uncared for properties. And we know that, we as people who understand ecology and people who understand landscape management, we know that the formality of a garden or the geometry of a garden has very little to do with which species you choose. So you can choose whether it's native or whether it's exotic. In fact, in other parts of the country, other parts of the world, many people use our native plants as their exotic plants. So sometimes it's okay, right? If it's exotic, we can use them in our formal gardens. Anyway, the formality or informality of a garden doesn't have to do with whether the species is native or introduced. It has to do with the structure of the plant, the bloom time of the plant, the color of the plant, how it lays in the garden, how it appears in the garden. So you can have an extraordinarily geometric and formal garden, or you can have a very loose and natural looking garden. But I never really want to encourage people to have messy gardens. Messy in that we're not too eager to clean things up very, very quickly, certainly, but not unmanaged, right? So we want to make sure that we keep that in mind when we're doing any kind of land management or making decisions based on our priorities and based on the criteria that we set for ourselves and our values. And one of those might be ecological value, one of them might be aesthetic value, another would be wildlife value, value to insects, values to caterpillars and butterflies and lizards and toads and frogs and spiders and everything else that are in the garden that make it the vibrant living ecosystem that it certainly can be. That's it. And I didn't have a place for this beautiful Luna moth, which overwinters as a cocoon and fall leaves. So I thought I'd put it at the end. I'm happy to address any questions that folks have been putting in the chat. And any other questions as the moderators like.
All right, this is your chance, folks, to ask your questions. I did see that Don had noted, early on that he didn't know that about the Tawny Emperor and the rolled up leaves, and I didn't know that either. So I think now all of us, we'll be looking up in those hackberries.
Yeah, definitely. You can find them. I find them all the time. I hate to actually open them up because I know that once you open them up, you've pretty much messed it up for that group. But for learning purposes, definitely do take an old one and open it up and see what it looks like inside. See the silk that's in there. See the larvae that have come out. It's really pretty cool.
And I think what's just so important is that. Trying to educate the public, and there's so much that happens, unseen, and your cross sections and showing, the larvae inside the stem, and things like that. And if the more people understood, that just because you can't see with your naked eye, right, that there's wildlife activity, there's activity going on in those dried out stems. Once that kind of gets into people's brains, then I think the aesthetic part comes to play too, because leaving those stems and all the different shapes and stuff of your perennials and everything in the winter, it gives some interest. It's a different texture. And
absolutely. I was rolling back to the beginning because the first slide I have is a garden that's a little bit more natural or a little bit more natural looking. And it has some of those textures in it that I just thought were beautiful. But they're an acquired taste, right? They're not there it is. Aren't they beautiful? Aren't those textures beautiful? And they are the different life cycles, the different times in the life cycles of different plants. And they're all important. Every bit of them is important. And I think that goldenrod example is a big one where I had no idea that if you took down those spent goldenrod heads, I knew that you'd be taking out seeds, which, that's a big deal. But what about those galls in there? If you take out all the galls, well, they're gone forever. So I agree. So so I see Don says like little Christmas ornaments hanging from a hackberry. Absolutely, it is really cool because the thing is once you know that they're there, you see them everywhere. And now I'm curious about every little grouping of rolled up anything that I find, and I want to know what it is that's inside. Okay, so I see any other considerations for winter management of large container gardens with native plants? Adding leaf litter seems like a good idea. Absolutely, adding leaf litter is a great idea. And of course, leaving them to, as they're spent, leaving them to stay in their pots, which is a difficult thing to do, you might want to do. Of course, since they're in pots, they are going to be experiencing more extremes of weather than they would if they were in the ground. So you might want to consider somehow insulating, grouping and insulating those containers. I don't know if they're pots or if they're like a container garden that's a little bit larger. Then if it's in a container garden that's larger, like maybe a 4x4 garden or something, I would absolutely be sure to cover that up with a good layer of 2, 3, 4 inches worth of leaves. Oh, one other thing that we use here at our house is we use leaves instead of any other kind of cover for our paths, the paths that we have going through our garden and around out front. We don't have concrete paths. We have, like trails, but they're defined trails. And instead of putting like rock and decomposed granite or something like that, we put pine needles because that's what we have here. And it works beautifully. It makes a beautiful little trail, especially as it gets packed down into it. And we know that we're providing pervious cover as well as rejuvenating the soil, which is pretty cool.
Great.
What's the best time to plant goldenrod? The best time to plant is the opposite season. If you got an actual plant, like a potted plant that you've purchased, the best time to do that is in the season opposite of its blooming. So you'd be planting in springtime for those fall blooming goldenrod. If you're planting seeds, then you take a cue from the actual plants that are growing in the wild. So they put out their seeds about now, actually. So if you go out, you'll see a whole bunch of goldenrods that kind of look like white goldenrods. You get closer and you realize they're all little seed heads on them. So you just take those seed heads off and you can distribute them. So so you would plant those about now. Let's see, food for thought. Yep. Tawny's. Yep. Rolled up leaves. Anything else? I got the chat up now.
Well, I really appreciate the fact that, your struggle with the term of messy garden. I hadn't thought that through, and it really, I understand wholeheartedly, why the reservation on that, because it's already, exactly. I mean, people already have, kind of preconceived notions of native gardens and things of that nature. And then you add on the word messy. And so, yeah, I appreciate that.
Oh, I appreciate that. It was only a thing that I had noticed. We just fight against that, but it wasn't. I mean, I was delighted to do the program. Hey, I mentioned mentioned that y'all are welcome to contact me anytime. I work for the state. I'm from the government. I'm here to help. Contact me anytime with any additional questions. I've dropped my email address and my title in the natural gardening. Well, that's why we call it wildscaping. But anyway, I dropped my information, contact information, and title into the chat, so that you can copy it if you want to and put it in your address book. If you have a question that comes up, a burning question at 3 o'clock in the morning, I will address it the next day. Thank you very much for inviting me. This is a delight, and I look forward to seeing y'all in person sometime again.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Kelly. And I think everybody thoroughly enjoyed the presentation. And yeah, get out and enjoy your winter gardens.
Thanks so much. We'll see you soon.
All righty.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for tuning in.